Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video.
Okay, that's our warning bell that it is 11 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Good morning. My name is Thomas Bowles. I'm the Ag Extension Agent here in Prince William County, and today's class is going to be on potatoes. Thank you all for joining us. So we'll jump right in.
Potato, potato, tomato, tomato.
So, potatoes, what's in a name? A little bit background about potatoes. Potatoes are mistakenly called Irish potatoes, and that's not really true because they come from the Andes. And actually, it's amazing how many species and subspecies of potatoes there are. And if you go to Bolivia, for example, and you look at potatoes planted on mountainside, you will see that there are different varieties for different strata of that mountain that have evolved or have been cultivated specifically for those areas. How we got to potato is the Spanish thought that they looked like sweet potatoes and called them batata, which became patata and then potato in English. They're in the same order, but they're different families. They are different and they produce different structures as what we eat. So potatoes are nightshades and they form tubers, which are specialized stems that store starch, and sweet potatoes are morning glories, and they actually store the food that we eat in their roots. Yams are more closely related to lilies than potatoes, although yams are used as the same way that we use sweet potatoes. So that's just kind of a wrap up of where we are in terms of potatoes, sweet potatoes, and yams. So they've been eaten for 8,000 plus years. The Spanish brought them back to Europe, and then from Europe, they got introduced to North America, even though they're South American natives. We started cultivating potatoes early on in the colonial period. 1621 is the first record of potato cultivation here in Virginia. By the 1700s, potatoes became a staple of the Irish. And the reason that happened was because they were cheap, high yielding, and it was easy to grow. Then unfortunately, we got the Irish potato famine because there was a late blight disease that wiped out the crops over the course of 2 years, causing lots of deaths and a mass immigration, mostly to the United States. So let's look a little bit about the potato itself in detail. They are very highly versatile. They are highly nutritious, and they are the most important non-grain food crop in the world. Again, because they are easy to produce and they have high yield potential. Virginia devotes about 4,200 acres. Most of them are in the Eastern Shore. Most of the potatoes that get grown in Virginia are for fresh sale, although some are processed into chips and frozen potato products. We have a Virginia, actually it's a Shenandoah-based chip company called Route 11 Potato Chips. They are the only potato chip manufacturer in the country that makes potato chips out of Yukon Gold potatoes. But they do other varieties as well. If you want to learn more about how a potato becomes a chip, see For the Love of the Chip, and there's a YouTube link there. It's an interesting video about how local food gets processed locally and then distributed throughout Virginia and to an extent beyond. So if we look at the different types of potatoes, as I mentioned, in the Andes, they have lots of different potatoes grown at different altitudes. But we've developed several different types of potatoes that have different uses. So some of them are starchy, which are good for baking, roasting, mashing, and frying. We have waxy potatoes that hold their shape really well, so they're good for salads and stews and things like that. And then we have all-purpose sort of potatoes that can be used either way. They're very thin-skinned, so they are easy to damage and don't always store it as well as some of the others. So if we look at the major types of potatoes and what they are in terms of starchy, waxy, all-purpose, our white potatoes are generally all-purpose. Our red potatoes are generally waxy. Our russet potatoes are very starchy. Burbank variety is #1 variety in the United States. That is in part to our friends at McDonald's. McDonald's is the largest consumer of potatoes in the country, and so a lot of the way that russets in particular are bred have to do with what McDonald's wants for their fries. And that is one of the reasons why, for those of us who are a bit older, you may have noticed that the skin on the russet baking potatoes have become thinner over time. That has to do with people growing varieties that are relatives of what McDonald's wants, because McDonald's doesn't want a thick skin when they're chopping them up for fries. Just a side note. So yellow potatoes are generally all-purpose potatoes. Fingerlings are usually waxy. Our colored potatoes, the blues and purple, depending on which variety, you're looking at waxy to all-purpose. And here's just a little bit of a graphic that kind of reinforces that. Generally, our starchy ones have low moisture. Our waxy ones have medium moisture versus starch. And then we do have some that are very low starch that tend to be on the waxy side. So growing potatoes, as I mentioned, growing potatoes are easy to grow. They're one of the easiest plants to grow, and they are high yielding. The soil that you have makes a huge difference. Thick, heavy clay soils that aren't amended are not conducive to root and tuber crops. So building soil and soil health are very important when we're talking about potatoes. So typically there are two ways to do it. One is to start with trenches, or there's a lazy way to do it, and I'll get to both of those in a moment. Potatoes have kind of a chandelier growth pattern. And what that means is there's a central seed potato, and then as the potato grows up, you get more and more side potatoes. The potato that you plant, that seed potato, that is the lowest you're going to get potatoes. And so if you don't either have a trench or mound them, you're not going to get as many potatoes. And again, I'll talk about that in a minute. They tend to have white or purple flowers, which doesn't really matter because you're not worried about pollination, but sometimes you get those.
Which wants the soil to go down.
They do have a cherry tomato-like fruit, but because they are nightshade, those fruits are poisonous. You do not, if for whatever reason your potatoes are in the ground long enough for them to produce fruit, do not eat the fruit because they are poisonous. So a seed potato basically is a small potato that has little eyes, is what we generally call them, but they're really little growth sprouts. And you can see from these pictures, these particular seed potatoes have a number of eyes, and that's where you're going to get stems sprouting from. So one of the ways that we can maximize our investment is that we can cut seed potatoes as long as we have in each piece, we have at least one eye. We can cut those, and then theoretically you can put them right in the ground. I like to wait overnight so that you get kind of a callus that forms over them, which helps reduce the potential for disease to get into it, because when you cut a potato, you of course are wounding it. You do have to be careful though. Sometimes when you cut them, they can get ugly and sort of have bacterial issues, and you don't want to use those seed potatoes. And when a seed potato that you cut has gone bad, the picture on the right is really what you're looking at. So here are some seed potatoes. And you can see how they have started to sprout. And that is why we want to make sure that when we cut them, we have those eyes. So some of these, the red ones, I believe, were stored and they started sprouting. So the question I get a lot of times is, well, can I use a potato that I buy at the store? My answer is yes and no. So a lot of potatoes get treated with a hormone so that they won't sprout, so that you have a longer storage. That's
Okay.
eventually that storage. Could we mute? Thank you. Eventually that hormone will wear off, and if the potatoes are stored long enough, then you'll start to get sprouted. And those are fine to use as seed potatoes. If you get organic potatoes, they are more likely to sprout quicker. So if you have a potato that looks like the one on the right, and it's organic, and you put it in the ground, it's likely to sprout. If it was treated, then it may or may not sprout when you want it to. So just something to keep in mind. And of course, you can buy seed potatoes from a variety of online, and in some cases, box stores and nurseries. So one of the ways that you can grow potatoes, again, remember the seed potato is the lowest point you're going to get potatoes. And so one of the things you can do is dig trenches. And so here we've got, this is from our teaching garden, and we dug trenches. Those are about, I'm going to say 8 to 10 inches deep. You could go deeper if you wanted to. Part of it is how much digging do you want to do at harvest time, and how big of a yield are you looking at. And so we spaced the seed potatoes, and you can see them there. There are 5 in that one trench. They're about 8 inches apart. You could go a little denser, but it fiddles with your yield. You could go less dense, but you're probably not really buying yourself that big of an advantage in terms of yield. So let's see if this video is going to play. Maybe. Okay, it doesn't seem to want to play. But as the potatoes grow, so let me go back for a second. Oops. Oh, here's the video. Here we go. Maybe.
Okay, this morning we are preparing our potato beds. We had a cover crop growing here, just like in this bed over here. We cut it down a few weeks ago, put black plastic over it. The black plastic is basically smothering what's left of the cover crop after a few weeks. And then we're left with what we have in this bed, where we're planting our potatoes. Dead cover crop. A little bit of cover crop that was okay, but we were able to do some light tillage and kill that off. And now what we're going to do is we're going to put some compost down. We're going to lay out our potatoes, and we're going to do potatoes the lazy way. Putting out potatoes, covering it with straw, and not digging the potatoes to do a no-till potato. Ellen's going to explain the math.
We're going to talk about the actual planting of the potatoes now. This bed is 4 feet wide by 14 feet long. As Thomas mentioned, we already have let this die back, and we're going to start by putting compost on it. But the actual math that follows it is as follows. We're going to plant the potatoes a foot apart in rows, and then rows 1 foot apart all the way down the bed. We're going to plant 3 different types of store-bought potato seeds: an early season red Norland, a mid-season Kennebec, and a late season heirloom Green Mountain. And then we're going to do an experiment this year, and we're going to use leftover seed potatoes from last year's harvest. So now we're going to go ahead and spread some compost across the whole bed before we plant any potatoes. And when you're planting anything, you always want to amend your soil. This is compost that we've made here in the teaching garden. We're going to go ahead and actually plant the potatoes right now. We've spread the compost, and as I mentioned earlier, we're going to plant the potato seeds approximately 1 foot apart in rows, and rows 1 foot apart. So in this particular bed, that's going to give us 3 potatoes in each row, and we're going to be able to put 3 rows of each of the varieties that we've done. So we're starting with the early season red Norland, starting about a foot in from the edge of the bed both ways. And then I'll take the second one, put that about a foot in. And then the last one will go another foot, again about a foot from that end and a foot from that end. And I'll plant 2 more rows of this. A foot this way. And for our 3rd row of our early season plants, put the last 3 in. And we have, as I said, a mid-season, a late season, and then a few rows of the experimental seed from last year. So we're going to continue down this bed. Each variety is going to have 3 rows with 3 potatoes in each of them.
Okay, so now we've got our seed potatoes out. We're going to cover it with straw. Be good. So 6 inches, maybe a little bit more here and there. Potatoes will grow up through this and make our job of harvesting that much easier, because we won't have to dig down into the soil. It'll all be in the straw layer. Potatoes are never going to grow deeper than the level we put the seed potatoes, so all our potatoes are going to be up here in the straw. And harvesting will be, as I said, very, very easy.
Okay, so I'm advancing again.
I've had all those expensive beds and consistently keep coming back to the Nectar mattress. This is the most comfortable bed you can get with.
There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so so there were 2 videos supposed to be there. The one that talked about how we do the hilling, we kind of missed the trench we kind of missed on. When you do the seed potatoes, you plant them the same way in terms of putting them into the soil, and then you cover it with soil. In either case, what happens is you get the potato will sprout, it will come up like we see here. And then we want to wait till it's about 6 inches above whatever medium we're using, whether it's the soil in the trench or the straw that we've thrown down. And then we're going to hill it with soil and or straw, depending on which system we're using. So you can see in this picture, this is the trench method, and we've got potatoes coming up, and so we're about to hill them. And this video may or may not play. Okay. Somehow we don't have audio for it though, but basically what's going on is that we're hilling these potatoes, and the idea is potatoes, just like tomatoes, will form underground shoots the deeper we put them into the soil. And so as we hill these potatoes, we're creating more space for those underground storage tubers. And we will continue to hill them as they start to grow out. We want a little bit of the leaves left so they still have access to sunlight and they're going to grow. But you can see with this hilling, we're basically we're raising the soil, which gives us more volume for our potatoes to grow. With the lazy method, I will say one thing, that I know people who've been very successful with that. And then I also know that when we experimented with it, we weren't quite as successful. We found that the trenching method is a whole lot more productive. And you can see here, like I say, you can see on the right how big the foliage is, and on the left, how little foliage we're leaving when we're doing the hilling. And you repeat this process over and over again. And if you run out of soil, and typically we use the soil from the trench that we dug, but when you run out of soil, you just use straw. So here we have another bed where we have we've hilled it. We've run out of soil, so we've started putting straw down. You can see this grass-like stuff that is in between our potatoes. That's cover crop that we failed to adequately kill, but in the long run, that didn't really affect yield too much. Basically, we just cut it down. We kept cutting it down and just threw it on top, and it acted just like straw. Gave us, as it dried out, gave us more medium in the end for our potatoes to grow. And then when we ran out of straw, we used other vegetation that we had harvested from a different bed where we let the cover crop grow longer. And so we're still doing that hilling process to get a nice big yield. This is when it's dried out. Again, still growing. Generally, we want to plant in March. You're looking at about 9 inches between rows. Again, the wider the spacing, the bigger the potatoes get. With the hilling method, you can, within the rows, you can go about 8 to 10 inches. With the lazy method, you want to go about 12 to 14 inches between the potatoes in the row. Most of our potatoes are going to mature within 100 to 120 days. There are some ones that go longer. There are a few that go shorter, which is why in the lazy method video, we were planting early, mid, and late season, so we had continual harvesting. Now, you can harvest new potatoes, which are immature, within a couple weeks, 6 to 8 weeks. They're going to be small. Then you can harvest when you've got thicker skinned ones and the tubers are about the size you want. Generally speaking, when you're looking for bigger potatoes, the plants can, sometimes they will start to flower. Sometimes they will look very distressed. And that's generally about the time you want to harvest. And then you want to cure for about 2 weeks to let the skins kind of toughen up. Ideally at around 50 to 60 degrees and relatively high humidity. And then these potatoes will store a lot longer. So here we have some red Norlands that came up from the lazy method, and you can see we just brushed the straw back, and then we pick these and put them by the side of the row. One thing you do have to be careful about when you're harvesting is sometimes you get, like the potato in the middle, if you're using a shovel, whether it's to push back the straw or to actually dig them in a trench system, occasionally you slice those potatoes. Are those potatoes useless? No. Basically, you want to wash them and use them as soon as possible. The other ones you can cure and store, and they will last much longer. So in 2019, we harvested russets that were, about hand size, which is about when you want to harvest them. The following year, we harvested red Norlands in a very compact bed. And that was the only yield, that was the yield that we got from one plant. And if you've grown potatoes before, you know that that's a pretty pitiful yield for one plant of potatoes. As I mentioned before, potatoes have a huge potential for producing tubers. So again, when you harvest them, they're a little thin. As they mature, they get a little thicker, but when you harvest them, the skin is easily damaged, and so you have to be careful. And again, you want to use those damaged potatoes first, and then allow the others to cure. This is on the right, you've got a picture of a harvest of Green Mountain russets in a very small area. All those potatoes were produced in a 3x4 section of garden bed. Some common problems. Potatoes are not problem-free, even though they're generally easy to grow. Colorado potato beetles are the #1 pest we've dealt with in our garden. Sometimes we can mitigate that by using a row cover. Again, we don't need to actually pollinate these plants, so letting pollinators in really isn't a problem. Potato scab is an issue, but there are lots of scab-resistant varieties, and if you lower the pH, the non-resistant ones will usually do better against scab. Leafhoppers can be a problem. Slugs. Slugs will go after the potatoes in the ground, and the longer you leave the potatoes in the ground, the more likely you're going to get slug damage. And so you just have to be careful about that. Generally speaking, with our potatoes at our demonstration garden, we get very little slug damage, but we do get some, as you can see in this potato on the right. And of course, being in the tomato family, any disease a tomato gets, a potato can get as well. So some non-toxic solution, floating row covers, as I mentioned, that'll discourage the potato beetles and leafhoppers. Where possible, you want to hand pick the insects that you find on the plants, dump them into a bit of water with some dish soap, and that will drown them. Straw is going to help with most of our diseases, because most of our tomato diseases are soil-borne. And so if you have bare soil and whether it's rain or you're watering, it's going to cause some of that soil to splash up. And when it does that, it'll carry disease with it. and then you run into some disease issues. And so having a layer of straw as the plants get bigger really does help with the disease issue. Straw also is a handy environment for spiders, and spiders do a lot of predation against some of our pest insects, and they will also go after young slugs. Some other non-toxic things is to practice the principles of soil health. Soil health is based around having a healthy soil ecosystem, and the healthier your soil ecosystem is, the more in balance the whole insect plant community is. And so the good spiders or bugs or what have you will keep the bad ones in check. You can see more information on that in USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Services webpage, which is on here. And soil health is basically, you want to minimize disturbance, which with potatoes is difficult unless you're going the lazy way. You want to maximize your soil cover, and that means having plants growing throughout the year. And that's why we use cover crops over the winter, because we want to take advantage of the solar energy that's coming during the winter and putting that into the plants. And by the same token, those plants are having symbiotic relationships with the beneficial microbes in the soil, keeping their populations high, so that in the spring, when we put the potatoes in, we're going to have those healthy, large, robust microbe populations. We ideally want to maximize biodiversity, and there are two ways to do that in a garden situation. One is to rotate crops. The other is to interplant. With potatoes, interplanting is a bit problematic, and so generally speaking, when we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about rotating crops. And then we want to maximize continuous living roots, which also plays into using cover crops. The thing about plants is that in a healthy ecosystem, up to a quarter of the sugars that are produced, they give to beneficial microbes, which helps with that symbiotic relationship. And in turn, the microbes can do a variety of things. They can help with disease resistance. They can protect against root diseases. In some cases, they can pass on nutrients or water to the plant where the roots can't reach. So soil health is very important in vegetables in general, because nature is taking care of a lot of the issues that you would otherwise run into, and you don't have to worry quite as much about things like pesticides. The other thing is, as I mentioned, with potatoes, you want to use crop rotation to break pest and disease cycles. The tricky bit is that eggplant, tomatillos, tomatoes, potatoes, they're all in the same family. And if you've got a small garden, sometimes that's a little bit tricky to try and rotate, but using cover crops does help with breaking up some of those cycles. If you'd like any of the links that are in this presentation, just email me and I'm happy to send them to you, so you don't have to write them down and type them back in, which I know can be problematic, especially if you mistype something. So again, feel free to do that. What else am I forgetting? If I didn't mention it before, in this part of Virginia, which is Northern Virginia, for those of you who are out of the area, we typically plant potatoes around St. Patrick's Day, and then harvest them typically in June. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. I'm sure I forgot something, and I'm sure you all have questions, so please.
We have some questions in the chat box. Does the straw have grass seeds, or might have grass seeds?
So straw, generally the straw that you get is wheat straw. So while it may have seed heads in it, generally speaking, that's going to be a winter wheat. So you may get a little bit of germination, but chances are you won't. And you can pull those young plants out fairly easily if you start to get it through. But generally speaking, we haven't had problems with that.
And should the potatoes be protected from deer and rabbits?
Ideally, yes. When we grow potatoes, we grow them in beds that have deer fencing. I don't think we've ever grown them in something that hasn't. Even though they're nightshades and a bit bitter, it's always a good idea to protect from deer and rabbits, and groundhogs for that matter. They're pesky as well.
With the lazy method, how do you deal with the hay seeds that germinate following the application of the hay?
Again, same issue. Generally, well, actually with jump back for a minute. In both cases, with the straw, if there are seeds in there, especially once you start putting thicker layers of straw as it's heating up, you are shading out those seeds that fall to the soil, because you have to have soil to seed contact for them to germinate. And if you shade them out properly, then there's no, once they germinate, there's no sun, and so because they don't have enough energy. I say that in our demonstration gardens, that's generally not been a problem.
How many plants would you suggest for a family of 10?
That's an excellent question, and one I cannot answer. Let me think about that. So it depends. The classic extension. It depends on how many, so are we talking about, having potatoes for the entire winter? Or the summer into the winter? Are we talking about having a couple meals with the potatoes? It really depends. And I know that's not the answer you want. But it depends on, how many potatoes you're going to actually use. And if it's going to be over time and just like 1 or 2 meals. I would say, particularly if you're going to try and store them and have them a little long term, probably a plant per person.
Okay, after it flowers, would you wait until it wilts? And can rain rot it?
So good questions. Generally speaking, about the time it flowers, so you start getting the first, if you've got a bed of potatoes, generally you'll start seeing 1 or 2 plants will start flowering. And usually within a week or 2, that's when you harvest. But I'm sorry, what?
It's, the question was, after it flowers, would you wait to wilt, and would the rain rot it?
I wouldn't wait until it wilts. It might get a little bit wilty, diseasey looking. But you don't have to wait quite that long. So rain and rotting. So generally speaking, if you've got well-drained soil, you're not going to have a whole lot of rotting issues. Unless you've got heavy, heavy rains where the soil is just saturated for an extended period of time. Going back to the whole soil health issue, when you've got healthy soil, it drains really well. And so typically you have less rot issues. We have a particular bed that is part of our rotation and have to put potatoes in. Typically on one end of the bed, it's really wet. And so we end up having to not plant potatoes in that half of the bed, because if we do, we just end up with too many rotted potatoes. It's just not worth it. So yeah, if you've got really wet soil, we want to put potatoes.
If we're planting in March and harvesting in the summer, where would you suggest storing the potatoes when it's really hot?
So ideally in your basement. I mean, so typically when we're talking about curing, at our demonstration garden, we have a problem because we don't have a place right there that's cool. But generally we do it in a shady, in our shed that has shade and good ventilation. But in a home garden situation, you'd harvest them and then you take them inside. Generally speaking, if you've got a basement, I put them in there because it's stable, cool temperature. Or maybe some other place in the house that's kind of cool, but not quite as cold as when you've got like AC and cold.
What about planting in containers?
Excellent question. So it's kind of a mixed bag. You can plant them in potatoes, and actually I've seen people do it in large trash bags. The tricky bit is that A, you're going to have to find soil for it, and B, if the container isn't really deep, you're not going to get very many potatoes. The second issue is I've seen people do it not only in trash bags, but also in trash cans, like the really big, 30, 40 gallon trash cans, is that while on one hand it's easier to harvest because you just dump it out, if you have too much soil, it becomes really heavy and hard to dump out. With the trash bag method, basically what you're doing is you're rolling back the plastic, you're putting a little bit of soil, you're putting your potatoes in, you're covering it up, and then as the plant grows, you're sort of hilling within the bag and you're rolling up the bag. The nice thing about that is when it comes time to harvest, you take your utility knife and you slit that plastic bag, you open it up, potatoes fall out. So containers are definitely an option. You need to think through what you expect your yield to be, and if you're using a really big container, how you're going to turn it over to get your potatoes. One other thing I should mention about potatoes is it seems like you never get all of the potatoes. We have beds where we've rotated potatoes, 5 years ago that potato pop up, and it's because of a potato that we miss. So that's one thing to be aware of, but you can transplant that and that you want to.
Can I jump in just a second? I do grow potatoes in potato bags, and the ones I have actually have, they have drainage holes, and they actually have a little like opening on the side that you can open and check and for the potatoes and dig them out. Usually though, and you continue adding soil as Thomas said, so mine are probably my potato bags are probably about 2 feet high. And I just keep adding soil, and I've had great success with growing potatoes every year in those potato bags. So they do work pretty good.
Yeah, that's another thing that what Christina's talking about is they do make specific bags for growing potatoes in. The method I was talking about was just using a black trash bag, and if you do that, you do need to poke drainage on them. So thank you for that, Christina.
Next one, are there any other amendments to the soil like NPK or other minerals to add for successful growth?
It depends. So ideally you want to have your soil tested and have an idea of what is in your soil. Generally speaking, if you've got really healthy soil, when you add compost in the beginning, that's generally all you need because that compost is providing carbon for the microbes, and the microbes are going to do their nutrient cycling for you. Also, if you've got a good crop rotation, depending on what you're planting, you can refurbish your nutrients by mixing your system. generally speaking, if you have a soil test and you run in something that's low, ideally you want to put an organic or slow release fertilizer in. If you do, if you have issues, your soil test will give you an idea of how much you're going to want to apply. Generally speaking, I haven't had to add any kind of actual VOT fertilizer for our potato plants in 13 years I've been here. I don't remember.
What is a good succession plant for before and after planting potatoes?
That's an excellent question. Before, it kind of depends on what your rotation is. Generally, you can plant pretty much anything unless you have a high nitrogen user in the fall before. In which case I plant over a cover crop. And it also kind of depends on what you're going to do after potatoes. Follow potatoes with a member of that same family, like say you're going to follow potatoes with peppers. Adding a little bit of organic nitrogen or slow release nitrogen, probably a good idea for peppers. But after those peppers come out, you definitely want to put something to apply nitrogen, clover, crop, or some other legume. Now you could, if you've got limited space, go potatoes and then plant beans for your summer crop, and that'll help restore the nitrogen in the seed.
Yes, the presentation will be shared. I'll send it out to everyone probably no later than Monday after it's edited. Next question is, where can I buy potatoes? I saw in the co-op 5-pound bags. Is there anywhere I can source locally and more quantity?
That's a good question. Locally, I'm assuming you're talking about Northern Virginia, but not necessarily. So your local co-op is probably your best option if you have one. Here in Northern Virginia, you might be able to get larger quantities at the co-op in Warrenton or the southern states in Catlett. Those would be my two go-tos. Because we don't grow commercially a lot of potatoes in this area, it's hard to get them in larger quantities.
Is this the same method for growing sweet potatoes?
Excellent question. Answer is no. Sweet potatoes grow down. So typically with sweet potatoes, you're going to dig a more shallow trench, put your sweet potatoes in, let them vine and grow crazy. Then in the fall, before your first frost, you're going to harvest them and you're going to dig down. And the sweet potatoes are going to, so you've got your sweet potato, or if you use slips, you've got your slip that you planted near the surface. The actual storage roots are going to be down from them. And as the sweet potato vines go over soil, they're going to drop nodes and they're going to drop sweet potatoes underneath those nodes. The thing is that the parent part, or the part of the plant where you planted, and again, we usually use slips as opposed to seed potatoes. That's going to have the most potatoes underneath it because that's where it's been growing longest. And you do have to be careful. There are people who want to grow sweet potatoes in containers, and the problem with doing that All those vines that trail out of those containers don't have anywhere to drop nodes to add to your sweet potato harvest. Sweet potatoes are a summer crop as opposed to a spring crop, and sweet potatoes are pretty much problem free. I think that answers the question.
Using the trench system, you said to cover the potatoes. How much soil should be you use to cover the seedlings?
At least 4 inches. I would say 4 to 6, really.
And what about watering requirements? Do they like to be kept moist?
They don't like to be kept too moist because then you have a lot of moisture. Generally, we water them about an inch or so. Once you get into cuban production in earnest, which would be about the second time you kill them, you might want to do a little bit more water per week. And ideally, you want to do that watering once a week. When it gets really hot and dry, you might want to split that into 2 applications. Yeah, because once they start producing tuber, you want that water because they do have a lot of moisture in them.
Okay, that's all the questions in the chat box. Does anyone else have any questions? If so, you can unmute and ask Thomas.
Hi, can you tell me where the local co-op is in Prince William County?
So there's a Southern States in the city of Manassas, depending on where you're coming from. It's on 28 just south of the city.
I know where that one is, yeah. Okay.
And
I
then
thought there was something I was missing.
the one in Catlett is farther down 28, just over the Fauquier line.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay.
Thank you all. If you have questions, feel free to email us. As Christina said, we're going to have the video up online here shortly, hopefully by Monday. Also, just email us if you want any of the links that are in the video so that you can have them, so you can just click them instead of having to copy them into your browser. And then in 2 weeks, Christina's going to do a presentation on gardening as we age. And so again, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.